Terrific. Welcome to maintaining clean and current website content without the stress. Hello, I am Laura S. Quinn. I am probably best known as the editor of the website or the nonprofit website Insider, which is a newsletter. I also am a coach and guide for nonprofit websites. So what are we going to cover today? So as I mentioned, it's going to be a little bit of a neutron star of information. It's a 30-minute seminar, which it's obviously a challenge to get, you know, useful amounts of information in 30 minutes, which is critically important to me. I'm not going to do a webinar if it's not going to have a lot of meaty information. So what you'll get is a lot of information at a very fast pace. You will indeed get the slides after, as well as the recording, if you want to slow me down, for instance. This is divided up into three categories. So we're going to start by talking about what clean content might mean to you, because it's very tricky to talk about maintaining a site without talking about maintaining it to what standard. And I think that people don't think about this enough. So we're going to actually look at that. So we're going to talk about an ideal process if you get to start from scratch, which is useful to think about conceptually, even though the vast majority of us are not starting from scratch. And then number three is where most of us are, will be making sense of a messy site. All right. So let's start with thinking about what does clean content mean to you? Melissa, could I ask you to take yourself off video just so it's clean for other people? Sorry, I thought I had turned that off. All right, so number one, make sure you have at least some content strategy. So you've defined things like who's your audience? What are the key kinds of posts that should be on the site? What makes each kind of post itself and unique? What makes each kind of post successful? If you don't really know the answers of these questions, doing more, taking it to the next level, which is in fact the next slide, gets very difficult. So you want to have an approximate idea as to what your content is for and how it is successful. Because then you want to think about what it means for each post. So for instance, what questions is this thing supposed to answer? What audience is it for? What actions do you want people to take? With some clients, I've talked about the idea of an article charter, and this is especially useful if there are multiple people, multiple stakeholders working on a particular article or a thing. So here are the key questions that this article answers, and framed from the visitor's perspective. This is not like what, for instance, in the legal aid world, this is not what the lawyers think this is about. This is the questions that your actual visitors have when they're visiting. And here are the key actions that the visitor should take after reading. And just continuing with my analogy, that should presumably not always be they should get a lawyer, because many of them can't get a lawyer. So and it's not always a legal action. So it's things like they should pay their rent if they're thinking they might get evicted. So thinking through very much from the visitor's perspective, what are they there to get an answer to, and what should they likely do if they have those questions? Or including maybe they should donate to you, or maybe they should go to this other page to find out more about you and your, free events for children. All right, so you need at least some style guidelines. So things that are going to make your site odd if different pages are in different styles. So things like, are you addressing the reader as you, or are you addressing kind of the world in aggregate as they? What's in title case? So what has everything capitalized essentially, versus sentence case where there's only one thing capitalized. You want to pick at least a site to reference for tone, like to say at a minimum, all right, we're going to pick this other nature sensor. We're going to pick this other site for that helps disabled people. And we're going to write like they write. Um, and if you want to take it to the next level, a high level style guide can be very useful. What we're looking at, you can see, goes a lot further than what I just talked about. So it's italics, it's bold, it's underlined. You want to consider having some guiding principles. Um, Getting people onto the same page with, like, for instance, what reading level you're writing to what extent you're following online best practices, which could be anything from, generally write for scannability and use bullet points to, like an optimum would headers should all be in the style of a question. Um, and that's kind of a rabbit hole in of itself, which if people have questions about that, I can answer at the end as to why that is. But there's a whole spectrum of online best practices you could go down to. Um, Accessibility, language access. So should everything that you have up on your site in English also be in Spanish, for instance, is a language access consideration? And this would also be a place to define what good content means. So if you define some of this stuff at a little more granular level, AI can help to write some of your content, write your content to these guidelines. So things like Claude or ChatGPT are at a level, and really only within the last 6 months or a year have they gotten to this level, that it can create a very credible draft in your house style. And it's very useful, especially if you're trying to like not only write in a house style, but optimize for SEO and like multiple things at the same time. That tends to be a pain. So you're always going to want to review the results before posting. You should never rely on AI to just be great. They don't go very far wrong very often these days, but your site is your site, and you don't want to be in the situation of blaming the AI for something that came on your site. This is, in fact, what we're looking at here is a custom GPT, which is Chat GPT, except it's a custom made thing. So I have created it. This is actually fairly new within the last couple weeks. I have created it to help with my nonprofit website insider newsletter, which has a fairly specific tone. Um, and here's me. This is the instructions are about 2 pages long, so about 1,000 words, as to how it should think about things. It has written a lot of its own instructions. So I've basically fed in a lot of content and said, please write a prompt that will make you write in the right way. Okay, no, that humor was way too over the top. Please write a prompt that will that compare this humor to the humor in what I gave you. What's wrong with it? What prompt would you write? So, and this is probably to the point where it doesn't waste time. It's might not yet be to the point where it saves me time, but I feel good about that it's going to get us there. So, but it's never going to replace. There's also a writer who helps me with this. It's never going to replace. Well, it's never going to replace me having the knowledge. Because if you expect it to have the knowledge, then all you're ever going to be able to publish is general things that is the average of what the web knows, which is not good stuff to be publishing on your website. And it's also never going to replace like kind of the creativity of an actual writer. All right. If you have questions, I love questions. Go ahead and add them into the chat. I will probably wait to the end to take questions unless this seems like there's something super on point. But yes, I will try to get to a few questions at the end in our half hour. And certainly I'll stay a little after the half hour to take questions. So we're thinking about content maintenance in particular. So if you get to start from scratch, if you are starting right now with a brand new website, it's a lot easier to maintain, to make a process to maintain that content than it is if you are in the place where almost all of us are, is that you currently have a site and it got some inherent messiness. But let's talk about um, start a kind of an ideal process. An ideal process is who's in charge. So who's in charge of all the content in the site? Who's the decider if a decision needs to be made, if people disagree? Who's in charge of whether each specific page is accurate and up to date? So there should be an owner of each specific page. Who else is involved with making decisions? And it can't be everyone. It's funny, I use this image on like nearly every presentation. I love it because it's like, this is too many people to make decisions. And you've also got this woman over here who is like, what the heck is going on here? So anyway, um, so when you post something for the first time, you should also, very quick process at this point, define when it should next be reviewed. So is this something that's going to fairly quickly go out of date and it should be reviewed again in 2 or 3 months? Maybe it's 6 months or a year before it's out of date. Maybe it's fairly evergreen. So maybe it's 2 years down the road, someone should review it again. And you'll also mark it with who will review it. This could be a role, or it could be, it should be a role that is designated a specific person. Could be a name with the idea that, all right, if they're gone in 2 years, whatever, they'll be replaced by a different name. But basically, it's a person and it's a time for this thing to be reviewed again. And then there's a process. So, like, for instance, this is not the only process, but you could say every whatever, depending on how big your site is, every week, every month, you send a few articles that are due for review to each reviewer. The reviewer looks through those articles and they put them into buckets. And it's important that what the reviewer is doing in the review period is not necessarily taking responsibility for updating anything that needs updating, because that'll get your process really bogged down. So the reviewer is instead flagging, okay, that looks good as it is. And in that case, either they or whoever is in charge of the review process simply resets the date for the next review. Great, it's reviewed, it's done. Next review is out on this date. It needs just a couple tweaks. In that case, it makes sense to get the thoughts from the reviewer as to what the tweak should be. Either they redline it, or there's a conversation, or there's some way in which that we capture what the tweaks should be. The tweaks are made and it goes back up on the site. But importantly, there's a separate process for them to say, ooh, like this is important, but there's just been a lot of changes. We need to update this thing. And it goes to a separate process. So basically, all they're doing in the review process is they're saying, this needs update. And there is a separate process to manage the things that need update. And there is allocated time and people to do those updates. So you're thinking of these updates as like you're thinking about new content, perhaps out of the same pool or perhaps as an adjunct to the pool, but it is something that is staffed and is meaningful. There's also the possibility that the article is not needed. So basically it was a news piece that is no longer relevant and you're just going to take it down. And so they should be able to flag that it's just archived. Thank you for the question and answer. So yes, I mentioned Claude. Claude with an E, like the name, is another AI tool conceptually similar to ChatGPT. Um, Great. So that's the ideal world process where you flag everything up front and then you just have an ongoing review process. Most of us don't live in that ideal world, unfortunately. So what then? So I encourage everybody to start with a finite set of content. Like, don't take on your whole bushel of oranges. You're going to take on just a few pieces to start. So, for instance, you might take the top 20 pages by number of visitors or the 30 highest priority pages to your organization or some combination of that. You're going to define criteria to audit by. So, for instance, and there could be a reasonable number of things you could have here. I actually have two separate articles on doing content audits that I'll send to you in the follow-up materials. So does it meet some minimum style guide criteria? Like, is this a mess or is it okay in terms of style guide, or is it right on, does it obviously need to be reviewed? Can I tell just at a glance that this thing is not good to go? Possibly, does it appear to be redundant with other pages? You're not likely to find as many of those in just a 20-page review, but you may well find that in a larger site review. You're going to put the URLs and the criteria into columns, some kind of spreadsheet tool. Doesn't really matter that much which one. Excel or Google Sheets work great. Something like Airtable, some people swear by. This is, although it's purposefully diagonal, so you can't really read it that well, is simply a spreadsheet with a lot of content and then a lot of things tagged as to, okay, when was it last updated? What audience is it for? Et cetera. And there were a lot more columns. And you want to find some quick wins to try to get the snowball rolling. If you've got a really messy site, trying to get momentum to get updates can be really tricky. And it's important to think about buy-in here. So you want to pick some high priority and low effort updates and do them so it doesn't just feel like this monumental task to stare at, potentially thousands of pages of content that you have no idea what needs to be updated. So you found some that need to be updated, which are important by some criteria, and you update them and you've got something done. So that's exciting, and you can get the snowball rolling. Okay. But if you've got dozens or hundreds or thousands of pages, that's not going to get you to a clean site and the ideal process. So what you need then is a robust content audit for potentially thousands of pages. And this is actually more doable than you might suspect. So I've done this with a couple of organizations, and it definitely takes time or money, but it takes 40, 60 hours-ish. You can generally define the project so that it fits in that. I mean, I don't think I've done anything that's tens of thousands of pages. You might want to do it section by section at that point. A couple of tips here. You want to empower a junior staffer or a contractor. So you don't want to say a subject matter expert has to review all the pages. It doesn't make sense for a lot of reasons, among other the cost. But you don't want to review to say, is this literally accurate? Because it's going to take forever. You simply want to say, has this been updated fairly recently? Does this potentially need review? You want to get through the pages fairly quickly. A contractor can also be really useful here. And you can probably find one for, I don't know, $40, $50 an hour. Not super expensive. Because while your staff tend to get waylaid by other important projects, a contractor is on a timeline and a time frame and is less likely to get waylaid. Um, Spread it out. It's a 40-hour project. That doesn't mean it takes a week, because that's going to want to make somebody like stab their eyeballs out. It's no more than a few hours a day. It's literally like I've put this picture here specifically, like it's somebody like putting some music on, going through. Basically, what you're doing is you're looking at like a page per minute and ranking it by probably four, five, six, seven criteria, with simply the idea that you can then go back to find the worst ones, the ones that don't need anything at all, like to go through and prioritize a project. Yes, four, five, six criteria. So you want to think through, you don't want too many criteria or it will take forever. On the other hand, if someone's going to look at all the pages, it's nice for them to look at this thing as well. So it's balancing which criteria to look at, is um, a useful thing. And in fact, in the article I'm going to send you, I have kind of a list of the types of criteria you might want to consider. And you want to be careful about how many decisions you're actually making while auditing. So you probably want to empower, even though they're a junior staffer, empower them to say, for instance, this looks like something that should be archived, for instance, because otherwise someone's going to have to review everything, to say, and yeah, you could say someone, yeah, the pages through them and make sure, but whatever. Um, but you don't want them to be there. You don't want a lot of really tough judgment calls, or it will take forever. Um, Great. And make sure that you actually take action on this. So this is logically doing the prioritization for a project of updating stuff. So you're going to start with high priority, low effort updates, and continue on and allocate staff and or money just like it is new content. So basically, you might want to think about, okay, what's the bare minimum of new content we need to do while we're doing this update project? Because once you get through this project, you can get into this more optimal process, and it's so much easier to maintain by reviewing consistently. There's so much less time involved, by just kind of getting yourself into this revolving process rather than letting it go a year and then auditing and figuring out what you've got and what the heck is happening with it. All right. I have actually made it through my neutron star of information with 4 minutes to spare. I'm going to take a couple questions, and I will certainly stick around while you have questions. Mary asks, when defining what decisions need to be made, does it help to think about it in batches? I'm unclear on what making decisions means in this context. Ah, yes. Um, so I'm thinking like a decision, for instance, as to what should be audited, or sorry, what should be archived, is potentially a decision that might want to be made in the course um, of auditing. Is this legally accurate? Not a decision that you want to make in the course of auditing, because you've got a junior staffer doing it who is not. So even if you had a subject matter expert, reviewing that whole thing in detail to see whether it's legally accurate is going to take forever. So basically, what can you review and make a decision on in a minute or so, um, or 2 minutes for unusual articles that maybe you can make a decision on? Fantastic. I'm going back through for other questions. We haven't actually had many questions. Questions that people have now or comments about what has worked for them. Fantastic. Yeah, Rebecca's mentioning integrating automation into our operations. Yeah, there's a lot of interesting places for automation here. So thinking through maybe reviewers can be automated reminders to go review themselves, review their own stuff. AI type tools can be thought of as automation. Um, so I'm my favorite question. Can you return to your contact slide? Um, let's see. Virginia asks, do I have example standard style guides, process definitions available? I have. So I showed you a slide of Illinois Legal Aid Online Style Guide, which is open to the public online. So I will send you that link. Um, I flashed at you a set of guidelines um, for these are both legal aid because I do a lot of work in the legal aid space, which I do not have permission right now to actually share out. I'll see if I can potentially get that. Um, process definitions. I don't have anything more than the flow that I showed you, which is obviously a very high level one. I don't have anything that I could like I've worked with clients to make them, but uh yeah, B. Ruiz. I'm not sure exactly what you're referring to. I'm certainly going to share. I'm going to share out a whole bunch of stuff, which is all the stuff I have available to share. Um, let's see. Kim mentions Michigan legal help started with a Leo's style guide and we've added to it over the years. For example, we recently decided it is okay to end a sentence in a preposition when it makes content more plain language. Absolutely. I think that yes, there's a lot of reasons that it makes sense just to copy somebody else's style guide. So to perhaps email folks at websites in your sector that feel like they may have their act together and to ask them whether they have a style guide, and if so, whether they mind if you borrow and adapt it. Because there's a lot of things that tend to be in a style guide that you probably don't care about that much, but are useful to standardize. Like whether or not you can end a sentence in a preposition. It does, like another thing for plain language. Does a sentence have to be a full sentence? Can something say, yes, you may? That might be a full sentence. But or like I know, like for instance, Ohio Legal Help will ask a question in a header and then simply answer it yes, which is not a sentence. So that is something that is part of their style guide, which you may or may not care about whether you do or not. Fantastic. I'm going to do an official thank you and goodbye as we are at the end of the time, but I am going to stick around for another couple minutes while people have questions, if they have questions. Um, I will in fact be sending out a recording, link to the slides, link to a bunch of other stuff, as I've talked about, some articles on content audits, some good stuff, for anybody who is, thinking about this. Also, I do cover a lot of information about content type things on in the nonprofit website Insider. So do encourage anybody who's thinking about that to sign up.